Thank you very much. No pressure. I'm being graded by an oral communication rubric tonight. My new text. So I'm very excited to be able, and very humble and honored to be asked to actually speak tonight. There are many people in this room that have pioneered and labored with myself on NGSS. So that's kind of my focus. I'm noticing that Denise is the only parent in the room, so I'm hoping there's more people who don't know much about NGSS because I'm going to be giving you some information back on that. But my title of my whole presentation was the 3 E's, and I didn't do that by mistake because I did have somebody ask, Kurt, there's 5 E's, right? And yeah, that's a learning model we're going to talk about. But I have 3 E's that drive me with NGSS. And the number 1 is engagement. So I want you to think back into your early childhood and think back to what was the thing that excited you about the natural world. Think about that for a moment. And then I want you to think back to who was that educator who may have inspired you or given you an activity that really piqued your interest. Okay, I'm going to tell you the truth. This is my story. So at an early age, I grew up in a small area of Arroyo Grande, California. Some of you, anybody from Arroyo Grande, California? Right on. Go Big Ditch. All right. So grew up in a small farm there. Spent a lot of time in the 4-H program. But honestly, I had teachers. It was the 3 R's. That's what it was all about. Science was not a big thing. The first real big exposure I had to science, I was excited about science. My parents let me get the chemistry kit, the science kit. I had all kinds of fun things. Had my dad's high school biology book at the age of 7, trying to look through all those pictures and figure out what was going on. But it wasn't until 6th grade science camp, and some of you have that experience, that really got me to go, wow, there's all kinds of great things. And it just really focusing on that. So NGSS is all about engagement. That's the number 1 focus, is that whole idea of inquiry and questioning, problem solving, and creating some kind of phenomenon that's going to put a wow on your face. That's the engagement piece of NGSS. So how does that play into my story? This is my first class. Amazingly enough, I remember every one of their names. Good kids. Good kids. I don't know where they're at now, 20 years later. Kind of make me tear up. So I got hired on a Friday, and I started class on a Monday. I didn't have a teaching credential. I had a bachelor's. Thank God Phil Bailey got me into what was known at that time as the SMART program, which was now currently Cal Poly's Learn by Doing Lab. So that's kind of where I got my start. Between that and 4-H, I made it through my first 2 weeks of school. Because I was going to school at night and teaching during the day. And that's how I worked for 2 years. So let me tell you a little bit about my students. Avenel Elementary, go Wildcats. Population, it was a K-5 elementary school of close to 1,300 students in one elementary school. We didn't even know each other as professionals because our school was so big. My claim to fame was I owned a basement. My room, because we went to 20-to-1 that year, and that's how I got hired, was that basically they took a storage basement and cut it down the middle and made 2 classrooms. We had no heating, we had no cooling. Some of you teachers in the room totally understand what I'm talking about. They looked at my resume, and honestly, they were so desperate because so many people had dropped out of this. The district, by the way, only had a 2-year longevity for teachers, so 2 years and then they were gone to another district. They were so desperate, the superintendent hired me, and my wife at the time, and they mixed up our resumes. So my wife, who had like 4 years of Spanish, I had 2 years of French. They gave me the combo class, 4-5, transitional English. All the bilingual students fed into my classroom. So it was quite interesting those first couple weeks, quite mind-blowing, because I grew up here. And yes, we do have a high Hispanic population, but for the most part, more and more, much higher as far as grade level compared to my students. So my student, Gabriel right here, came to me as a 4th grader. I also had him as a 5th grader. He started as a pre-primer with me, reading. And he'd been at this school for all that time, and he was still in the pre-primer stage. I'm like, holy cow, you know, I'm doing the good teacher thing, bringing out, you know, the state-mandated ELA curriculum. And they're like, oh yeah, we've already read all that. I'm like, really? So it was, how do I think out of the box? And that's where I went back to my science education. And it changed basically who I am as an educator. And honestly, I hope it changes a lot of you in the room as well. Some of you, I know I've already changed, so it's good. So my whole thought was, I gotta throw out all of this because they don't know how to read. They still had writing. Well, writing was horrid. So I said, you know what? It's all through the lens of science. So I started doing whole language and whole math, and some of you have been in the industry for a while. That was a pendulum, right? You know what? I heard it, and I said, hey, this is the way to go. Well, interestingly enough, that lens took these guys further than I would have ever thought. These kids were so interested in what I had to give them, the engagement piece. The piece of, we're going to read everything there is to know about the ocean. And by the way, we're going to go to the ocean. That was big. For these kids, they've never seen the ocean before. So that was a huge, huge thing. So with NGSS coming in, reading through it more, and now looking at it, reflecting later, there have been whole studies on ELA and acquisition and development through the lens of science. San Diego State it was before actually NGSS, maybe it helped inform NGSS in 2002, did a whole study in El Centro Unified as to how you could raise, and it was about 30 to 40% of students going from limited to fluent as far as raising just an interest of looking at science. So this is my other E, is the fact that NGSS, we can, if we scaffold it correctly and we use that engagement piece, that phenomenon piece, we open doors to students maybe we've never opened doors to before. So that brings me to my next slide. Some of you are like, oh, I'm going to sleep now, because I know this part. Well, this is kind of the next part of my path. So I spent a couple of years at Mill Elementary, and then I got hired, as Nancy mentioned, at Jenkins Middle School in Pismo Beach. So I went from a basement to an ocean view. Boy, did I brag. I'm just going to say. I'll never forget the interview. I almost cried because it was like, oh, thank goodness I'm out of the basement. So I spent 13 years teaching 7th grade science at Jenkins Middle School. And my whole, at that time, when I was hired, it was the first year they actually had California state science standards. 1998 was the first time that the state had actual science standards. Before that time, it's whatever you wanted, a la carte. This is what we taught before. Oh, yeah, this is what I'm going to teach. And go from there. So, got the new standards, excited about them, but still that whole idea of using engagement and that lens to be able to teach my students. Also, I'm a huge believer in, I may have a science degree, I may have a science credential, but all of our kids need to learn how to read, how to write, and how to do math. But we need to know a way to trick them. And my 2 former students over here, they may talk about that later in their presentation, but I learned how to engage students and, to some way, trick them into really getting excited about this. But my whole focus was one dimension. Okay, at that time, our former standards was all core ideas, content, facts, factoids. Remember it, remember it. Okay. Oh yeah, and let's throw in the scientific method too. Kind of thing. different shift. So I had kind of, my wife calls it a mid-career crisis, because I decided to jump out on the edge and start a project-based learning school with some of the people here in the room. And it was at that time that I was introduced to NGSS. And honestly, the way I was introduced, sorry Nancy, it wasn't Nancy, it was Nancy's students who introduced me to NGSS. So I had student teachers who were coming in and saying, oh no, Kurt, this is the way that, I'm like, oh, that's how we're supposed to do it, okay. So I knew that I needed to start shifting, okay? And the whole idea in that shift in my last 4 years was this focus, this Mobius strip. And those of you who are familiar with that, it's the whole idea that it's continual, constantly going. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the practices and cross-cutting and the core ideas. But just that idea, so once again, my E comes up, science is for everyone. All learners. So, this gets to more of the instructional part. So for those of you in the room who don't know, our standards are now called performance expectations. It's what are students going to demonstrate to us to show their proficiency. Part of that is they got very smart in basically weaving 3 different parts into NGSS. So the first part is our science and engineering practices, or basically what our students do. So I was just working with Lori, Melanie, I didn't work with you, I worked with you in December. But we were literally teachers working with TK, K, first and second grade teachers last week, and we were all chanting, blue is what they do, okay? Very important. Color in the standards is very important to read. So these are all the things our student scientists and engineers are going to be doing, okay? And we're going to look for that in our performance expectation when we break it down. There's also the disciplinary core idea. That's the content. That's that one-dimensional thing, and these are all the different parts, life science, physical science, earth and space science, and then the engineering part, which for my teachers kind of started out as scary, so now I'm transitioning into being the professional development director, basically, of curriculum for Atascadero. But I think they're finding more and more it's easy and doable, just like Christy said. Don't make it hard. The final piece, probably the most important part, is the cross-cutting concepts. This is how you want your students to think. This is a part where it has to be taught. So this is something that you have to, as an educator, spend time pointing out patterns, teaching what patterns are, cause and effect, and Holly will probably talk about a lot of that in her presentation. And going through all of these particular steps and different lenses to look at different phenomena and inquiry. So, models best, teaching this, project-based learning. So that was the one I stepped into. It's that whole idea of authentic inquiry, problem solving, but also having a big driving question that is open-ended. And then the 5 E's model. No, I didn't forget, I said there are 3 E's. These are the 5 E's. Engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And honestly, a lot of teachers, that's more their focus, and that's fine. According to the framework for NGSS, these are their 2 most recommended ways to teach NGSS performance expectations. So lesson sequencing is needed in both models. So lesson sequencing meaning it's not one and done. It's not one lesson. It may be a series of lessons. And then based on students explaining phenomena or problem solving. So making sure that that phenomenon and the inquiry and problem solving is going on. So, our work in building capacity. So I have a few people I'm shouting out in the room. Tristan Schroeder, where are you? Raise your hand. Okay, so Tristan is our one and only teacher on special assignment of all of our districts for NGSS. And luckily enough, he's one of my best friends. So I pick his brain a lot. And we do a lot of collaborating. But I also have another sidekick, and she's sitting right in front of me, Trina Nicholas. Trina Nicholas is the with Paso Unified. Tristan's with San Luis Postal. But Trina is the director of California Science and Math Project, which has been a huge help to our county as far as our 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade elementary school teachers. So for the last 3 summers, these teachers, and maybe even more, have extensively worked with Cal Poly in learning and diving into these NGSS standards for their grade levels. And they know a lot more than I knew when I first started this biology class at New Tech. So I know mainly about the 4 big ones as to what's going on. A little bit with Templeton, because like Christy, my kids go to Templeton Unified as well. But San Luis Coastal, working as far as very hard in educating and training. And basically the big thing that all of us in the room that work together on this part would say, it's that giving you permission to be great. Being willing to take a risk. Looking at those standards and collaborating and just being willing to try something different. So these are my 3 E's. Engagement, English language development and acquisition, and everyone can learn from the lens of science.